unfortunately, I think there is a substantial likelihood this could expand. Iran does support Hamas. They do support Hezbollah. There's multiple groups in Syria they support, and the Houthis all the way down in Yemen. If they wanted to orchestrate this, they could open up a forefront war against the IDF. If that happens, it is possible the United States would become directly involved militarily.
Let me ask you, first of all, about that news conference given by Benjamin Netanyahu, saying that there was not going to be a ceasefire because that would be to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to the terrorists. It seems that for now, at least, Israel is determined to press on with the war.
So yes, and they've already inserted troops, I think around 10,000, maybe even higher, into Gaza. So a ceasefire now would be very difficult. They'd essentially have to pause in place, and they'd have to rely on Hamas not to take advantage of that situation. So I do absolutely think there should be humanitarian aid coming into Gaza. Should have been coming in the whole time. There's innocent civilians there that need to get that aid. There's also third country nationals there that are also running short of food and water. So that needs to happen. But I think a ceasefire at this time would be implausible from a military perspective, unless the ceasefire would also include them withdrawing all the way out of Gaza, which they wouldn't want to do because then they'd have to go back in after the ceasefire.
We're seeing increasing reports of just the scale of the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding inside Gaza. We saw people breaking into some UN relief stores in southern Gaza. We're hearing claims from Hamas that there are up to 8,000 people dead there. Here in the UK, there's a big debate about whether our political leaders should be pressing for a ceasefire. Is there any of the same pressure on Joe Biden there in the United States?
Yes, I think there is. I think there's certainly some pressure on the U.S. pressuring Israel for a ceasefire, and there's a lot of pressure to make sure that humanitarian aid gets in there. Again, I don't know why that wasn't the case. To be quite frank, Hamas has probably stockpiled food, water, and medicine long before they launched the attack on October 7th. So the people who aren't getting the food is likely the innocent civilians, not Hamas. But I do think that's going to be a growing concern. And of course, also the civilian casualties. As this ground war starts to get going, it looks like they're encircling Gaza City right now. They're on the outskirts. They came in from the sea. They came in from the north. And it looks like they came in from the midsection by Khan Yunis. As they get closer and closer to Gaza City, you're going to see this fighting get more intense. And unfortunately, it's probably going to result in more civilian casualties. And I think there will be more pressure to make sure that those are minimized as much as can be possible by the IDF.
And Benjamin Netanyahu talked about a long war. We heard from a former British Foreign Secretary saying that he believed that could well be 2 to 3 months. Would you expect the fighting to continue along those sorts of lines for that long?
I think it's plausible. If you look at Mosul in 2016, that took 9 months, and there was 9,000 fighters, ISIS fighters. There's 40,000, we believe, Hamas fighters. And if their objective, as they keep stating, is the destruction of Hamas, it's going to take a long time, and they have to deal with the tunnels, which also was not a factor in Mosul, Iraq. So unless they change their actual objective to diminishing them, to depleting their supply of rockets, they won't be able to just go in and destroy Hamas in weeks. It will take months, and it could be more than 3 months.
And do you get the sense that Israel has a plan for what happens after this phase of the conflict, even if they do reach the stage where they believe they've destroyed enough of Hamas's infrastructure and senior commanders? I mean, Ehud Olmert, former Israeli prime minister, was telling me earlier that he does not believe that Israel wants to occupy Gaza. But, I mean, can it afford to simply pull out?
So if the destruction, which also includes keeping them from reconstituting themselves, is in their objectives, which it is, then they're either going to have a permanent presence on the ground. They might have to have something like they have in the West Bank, where they have near daily access if they need it. Or, and I think the former prime minister mentioned this, there needs to be an international peacekeeping force, which now that would be the time, to your point, when the international community can put their money where their mouth is. Because it's easy to sit on the sidelines and talk about what people should do, but it's another thing to actually take action and be part of the solution. That's probably where this needs to go if we want to make sure this doesn't happen again, because I don't think Israel wants to be on the ground long term. There'd be a massive insurgency likely, and it would not be in their interest.
But in the meantime, what do you think are the risks of escalation? We've already seen some Hezbollah attacks into northern Israel. Hezbollah, of course, is backed by Iran. We're hearing lots of warnings about the potential for Iran getting involved and this conflict escalating and involving other countries.
So, Carol, unfortunately, I think there is a substantial likelihood this could expand. Iran does support Hamas. They do support Hezbollah. There's multiple groups in Syria they support, and the Houthis all the way down in Yemen. If they wanted to orchestrate this, they could open up a forefront war against the IDF. If that happens, it is possible the United States would become directly involved militarily, most likely air. If that happens, Iran could get involved, and then we have a regional conflict, which would be in nobody's interest. I certainly don't think the United States, the UK, or any other country would like to see that happen, but they also won't allow, I don't think, will allow Israel to be defeated, especially if Iran gets involved in this.
And we've already got American warships in the region. Britain also sending military warships to that region. I mean, do you think that they could end up being directly involved under the sort of scenario that you're outlining?
If that scenario happens, and I don't know that it will, but if it does, that is why they're there. There's 2 aircraft carrier strike groups in the Eastern Mediterranean. To my knowledge, that's unprecedented. They have, and it's not just aircraft carriers. They have destroyers, they have cruisers, and there's a contingency. It's called the Marine Expeditionary Unit that's moving up there right now. That's 2,000 Marines plus another 4 or 5 ships, also air power. So there's more and more military assets that are being plussed up in the region, not just the United States, as you mentioned, the UK, and I imagine you'll see more because this has a chance of escalating. And the idea of deterrence is that if we put enough assets in the region, it will deter that from happening. Hopefully that is the case, and cooler heads will prevail.
So those warships and so on are intended to deter Iran from getting involved. But does it make it more inevitable that if there are further attacks, if Iran does foment more difficulties, if there are more concerted pushes into northern Israel by Hezbollah, do you think that the United States would feel that it had to intervene?
I think because that would open up with Hezbollah a 2-front war. If Israel looked like it was going to be defeated by that, I think the United States would possibly use their air power. There's 16 squadrons between the 2 air strike groups, use their air power to push them back. I don't think there'd be a need for ground troops. Israel has, around 170,000 active and around 360,000 reservists. It just simply wouldn't be needed. But the air power that could come off of those 2 aircraft carrier strike groups would be substantial, and it would do serious damage to Hezbollah. Again, hope that doesn't happen, but they have to be moved there now, because if you try to make a decision later, it takes a long time to get those assets to the region. So that is why they've been pushed there, I think, to prepare for this eventuality.
Just finally, are you concerned that there don't seem to be much effort underway to de-escalate this, to try to broker any kind of calmness, any kind of even the humanitarian pauses that both President Biden and the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak have been talking about, let alone any talks about trying to look at some future diplomatic solution?
So I definitely think there should be more pressure to make sure humanitarian aid gets into Gaza. I think it could be used, quite frankly, to get civilians out of the path of this, what looks like it's going to focus on Gaza City, and down to a safe haven where there is absolutely a no-strike zone where humanitarian aid is given out. I think that should be more pressure to do that, and I don't know why it's not happening, but that's one thing. The other thing is the international community can start working on a diplomatic plan for when this is over. Israel's obviously going to fight back, and they're going to fight Hamas. I don't think there's any country in the world that wouldn't do that, that would take the type of attack against their civilian population that they did on October 7th and not respond. But I do think that the world does not have to wait to start talking about what is the solution. It's a two-state solution. How is that going to go about? How are we going to go about doing that? How are we going to go about making sure Hamas doesn't reconstitute itself? What is an international peacekeeping force going to look like? Those are things that doesn't have to wait. That's something the international community can do right now, so that when there is a cessation of hostilities, probably after Hamas is at least significantly degraded, that this is something we don't start from scratch.